California, a state of sweeping coastlines, sprawling suburbs, and bustling cities, is often imagined as a place of opportunity, family life, and dreams realized. But behind many closed doors, reality can be far darker. Among the millions of households in this state, a small number have been marked by acts so shocking they challenge everything we think we know about motherhood. Tonight, we explore 10 notorious mothers in California, women whose actions left communities stunned, courts debating culpability, and families forever changed. These are not tales of mythical villains. They are stories of real people, making choices with real consequences. Some were driven by stress, isolation, or untreated mental illness. Others concealed years of neglect or abuse. And some were victims of systemic oversights, where warning signs were repeatedly missed. From Ventura County to Mendocino, from Palmdale to Sacramento, these stories span decades, geographies, and family structures. They force us to examine the complexities of maternal instincts, societal expectations, and the human psyche under pressure. As we journey through these cases, consider this: appearances can deceive, danger can hide behind smiles, and tragedy often strikes where least expected. Each story is not only a cautionary tale but also a reflection on our communities, our systems, and the fragile lives of children. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss a story like this. And tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far these stories reach. Case 1: Socorro Caro, Ventura County. Socorro Caro, known to friends as Susan, lived in a quiet Ventura County neighborhood with her 4 sons. From the outside, she appeared to be a devoted mother, preparing breakfasts, driving the children to school, and keeping up appearances that suggested a typical suburban family. Yet behind the facade, the daily pressures of her life were quietly building into a storm. Susan's marriage had been strained for years. Financial disputes, disagreements over parenting, and persistent tension created an atmosphere of unease. Friends noted that in the months leading up to the tragedy, Susan had become more withdrawn. She rarely socialized, often seemed fatigued, and occasionally spoke of feeling overwhelmed. These were subtle warning signs that, in hindsight, painted a portrait of someone struggling under immense emotional and psychological pressure. Adding to her challenges, Susan had a documented medical history, including neurological conditions that affected her mood and emotional regulation. While these conditions alone did not predict the actions that followed, they contributed to the complexity of her mental state. Some psychologists would later describe her behavior as the tragic result of cumulative stress, emotional instability, and an inability to cope with mounting personal and familial pressures. On a night in 1999, everything changed. 3 of Susan's sons were found lifeless in their beds. The youngest, miraculously, survived. Emergency responders arrived to find Susan injured, an apparent attempt to take her own life. The neighborhood, which had known her as a quiet, polite woman, was thrown into disbelief. How could a mother, someone entrusted with the care of her children, reach such a point? Neighbors later recalled that Susan had once been attentive and caring, but had recently grown distant. Teachers and school staff noticed signs of fatigue and occasional disengagement, but nothing that suggested imminent danger. Psychologists reviewing the case argued that the signs were subtle, often lost in the context of a busy, modern family, highlighting the difficulty of identifying risk when emotional struggles are hidden behind everyday routines. The trial was highly publicized. The prosecution emphasized the deliberate nature of her actions, pointing to evidence that Susan had contemplated harming her children in the weeks leading up to the event. The defense focused on her medical history and emotional fragility, portraying her as a woman overwhelmed by circumstances rather than inherently violent. Both sides painted a complex portrait of a mother whose love for her children was tragically intertwined with despair and dysfunction. Ultimately, Susan Caro was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Her case sparked debates about mental health, familial stress, and community responsibility. It prompted broader conversations in Ventura County about the need for early intervention, social support systems, and mental health awareness among parents under extreme pressure. For the neighbors, the children's friends, and the wider community, the tragedy served as a haunting reminder. Sometimes, outward appearances can mask profound suffering and the signs of a family in crisis are not always obvious until it is too late. Could anyone have predicted this? Do you think more could have been done to help Susan before it was too late? Share your thoughts in the comments. Case 2. Megan Hogg, Daly City. Megan Hogg was a single mother living in a modest apartment in Daly City, California. Outwardly, she appeared to manage her household with quiet diligence, juggling work, school routines, and the everyday challenges of raising 3 daughters alone. Neighbors described her as polite, reserved, and private, someone who rarely invited anyone into her personal life. To those around her, Megan's life seemed ordinary, stable even, but appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the calm exterior, Megan's household was increasingly isolated. She had limited contact with extended family or friends, and social interactions were rare. Isolation can intensify stress, leaving a parent vulnerable to emotional strain without support or oversight. Psychologists later examining the case noted that such conditions could exacerbate existing mental health challenges, creating an environment where tragedy could quietly unfold. In 1998, Megan's daughters were found lifeless in their apartment. The revelation stunned Daly City, a quiet, family-oriented community where such violence was unimaginable. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile the image of a seemingly loving mother with the horrific outcome. Authorities discovered no overt signs of prior violence, making the events all the more shocking. During the trial, investigators pieced together a narrative of subtle neglect and emotional instability. Megan had no prior history of violent behavior, which complicated efforts to understand how this tragedy occurred. Experts testified that a combination of prolonged isolation, possible undiagnosed mental health issues, and overwhelming stress could have contributed to her actions. Psychologists noted that her case exemplified how danger can exist quietly, often invisible to neighbors, friends, or even authorities. The legal proceedings were lengthy and complex. Megan entered a no-contest plea and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. While the case's focus was understandably on the events themselves, it also sparked a broader discussion about how social systems monitor and support single parents. How can communities detect hidden struggles in homes that outwardly appear normal? Could social workers or school officials have intervened sooner? These questions lingered long after the trial concluded. Neighbors recalled small details in hindsight: children seeming withdrawn, inconsistent school attendance, or unexplained injuries, but none seemed serious enough at the time to warrant concern. This case highlights the difficulty of interpreting subtle signs of distress in everyday family life, and the tragic consequences when warning signals go unnoticed. For the public, Megan Hogg's story served as a grim reminder that tragedy doesn't always come with loud warnings. Sometimes, it develops quietly in homes that seem ordinary, leaving communities to grapple with disbelief, sorrow, and questions about what could have been done to prevent it. Case 3. Pearl Fernandez, Palmdale. Pearl Fernandez lived in Palmdale, California, with her 3 children and her boyfriend, Isaro Aguirre. From the outside, she was just another parent in a modest neighborhood, driving her kids to school, grocery shopping, and maintaining the appearance of a functioning household. But the reality inside the Fernandez home was far from ordinary. Gabriel Fernandez, Pearl's 8-year-old son, endured a life of escalating abuse over months. Neighbors occasionally heard loud arguments, but it was the quieter moments, his reluctance to attend school, bruises on his arms, withdrawn behavior that told a more troubling story. Teachers and school staff reported concerns multiple times, and Child Protective Services were notified, but despite repeated warnings, no meaningful intervention occurred. Gabriel's suffering continued largely unnoticed, a tragic example of how systemic failures can allow abuse to escalate. Pearl's relationship with Aguirre added another layer of danger. The couple exhibited controlling, aggressive behavior, and both participated in acts of discipline that went far beyond acceptable limits. While friends and neighbors described Pearl as occasionally attentive and affectionate toward her children, those moments were overshadowed by a pattern of cruelty that ultimately became fatal. The night Gabriel died marked the culmination of months of abuse. Emergency responders found him gravely injured, and his death sent shockwaves through the community. Investigators quickly pieced together a history of prolonged mistreatment, leading to a high-profile trial that gripped the nation. Pearl Fernandez was sentenced to life without parole, while Aguirre received a death sentence for his role in Gabriel's death. Experts examining the case pointed to a combination of personal instability, coercive dynamics in the household, and missed opportunities for intervention. Pearl's actions, while undeniably horrific, were seen by some psychologists as the tragic outcome of accumulated stress, untreated mental health issues, and an environment that normalized violence. The case became a stark example of how children can slip through the cracks despite multiple points of contact with protective systems. The trial also exposed systemic weaknesses in child welfare. Why were repeated reports not adequately investigated? How did Gabriel remain in a home where harm was ongoing? Social workers, law enforcement, and legal professionals faced intense scrutiny, prompting reforms aimed at improving communication, response times, and monitoring of high-risk households. For the Palmdale community, the case was devastating. Neighbors, friends, and extended family struggled to reconcile the image of Pearl Fernandez as a mother with the reality of the abuse she inflicted. Psychologists emphasized the importance of recognizing subtle signs of distress in children and the critical role of community vigilance. Pearl Fernandez's story is not just about maternal criminality, it is a warning about the consequences of systemic oversight failures. It forces viewers to consider how society protects or fails to protect its most vulnerable members. And while the trial delivered justice in a legal sense, the emotional scars and questions remain, haunting families and communities long after the courtroom drama ended. Case 4. Elizabeth Schatz, Paradise. Elizabeth, Liz Schatz, lived in Paradise, California, with her husband and a growing family of adopted children from abroad. To neighbors, the family appeared devoted, caring, and committed to building a structured household. But behind the doors of the Schatz home, life was far from idyllic. The Schatz household adhered to strict religious and ideological principles, emphasizing discipline, obedience, and adherence to rules. While some families might view this as structured parenting, the reality for the children was one of extreme control and fear. Minor missteps were met with harsh punishment, and emotional warmth was often conditional, given only when the children strictly followed the rules set by Elizabeth and her husband. 8-year-old Lydia, one of the adopted children, endured prolonged abuse that ultimately led to her death. Another child required hospitalization due to injuries inflicted during daily disciplinary practices. Neighbors recalled hearing occasional shouting, but often attributed it to normal parenting disputes. It was only after the fatal incident that the full extent of the abuse came to light. The legal proceedings were intense. Both Elizabeth and her husband were convicted of murder and child abuse, receiving long prison sentences. Their case drew national attention, forcing a broader discussion about the intersection of adoptive parenting, religious ideology, and child protection. Experts emphasized that while discipline is part of parenting, extreme control and physical punishment can escalate into life-threatening abuse if unchecked. Social workers later revealed that the family had been difficult to monitor due to frequent relocations and the private nature of their household. The case highlighted gaps in oversight for adoptive families, especially those adhering to strict or unconventional ideologies. Authorities faced criticism for not detecting the abuse sooner, sparking calls for reforms in monitoring high-risk homes. The Paradise community was left grappling with shock and disbelief. Liz Schatz, known to neighbors as a polite, caring figure, had hidden a darker reality behind her public persona. The tragedy prompted reflection on how easily appearances can deceive and how children in structured yet isolated households may suffer silently. Psychologists analyzing the case pointed to a combination of factors: extreme adherence to ideology, parental authority without accountability, and a lack of external support systems. Together, these elements created an environment where the children's vulnerability was amplified and the warning signs were ignored or misinterpreted. Elizabeth Schatz's story forces viewers to confront uncomfortable truths. Even in families that seem devoted and structured, danger can exist. The case serves as a sobering reminder of the responsibility communities, adoption agencies, and social systems have to ensure the safety of vulnerable children. Case 5. Jennifer and Sarah Hart, Mendocino Coast. Jennifer and Sarah Hart presented themselves as the perfect family on social media. Their lives, filled with outdoor adventures, smiles, and carefully curated family photos, portrayed a picture of happiness and success. Living along California's scenic Mendocino coast with their 6 adopted children, they seem to embody modern family ideals. But the reality inside the Hart household was far from idyllic. Neighbors occasionally noticed that the children appeared anxious and withdrawn. Reports surfaced of truancy, inconsistent attendance at school, and minor injuries with unclear explanations. The Hart's home was often isolated, and the children had limited contact with peers or extended family. While the public saw joy, the private reality was marked by strict discipline, emotional neglect, and a level of control that experts later described as manipulative and coercive. On a summer day in 2018, the Hart family tragedy unfolded. Their SUV was found at the bottom of a cliff along Highway 1. All 8 family members perished. Investigators concluded that the vehicle had been deliberately driven off the cliff, suggesting that one of the mothers had intentionally caused the deaths. The shocking revelation stunned the nation, leaving communities struggling to reconcile the online perfection with the private horror. The case prompted widespread analysis by psychologists and child welfare experts. They highlighted a pattern of performative parenting, where outward appearances masked severe dysfunction. Jennifer and Sarah Hart maintained a controlled environment, suppressing the children's autonomy and creating fear-based compliance. The combination of isolation, emotional neglect, and coercive control contributed to the tragic end. State and federal agencies came under scrutiny after the tragedy. Questions arose about whether earlier signs of neglect had been overlooked. The children had transitioned from foster care in Texas to California, and gaps in oversight between jurisdictions may have prevented timely intervention. The case highlighted systemic vulnerabilities in monitoring adoptive families who move across state lines. Neighbors, community members, and online followers were left grappling with disbelief. How could a family that appeared happy and thriving be hiding such intense dysfunction? The case forced a national conversation about the influence of social media on perception, the hidden nature of familial abuse, and the challenges authorities face in detecting early warning signs. Psychologists emphasized that the Hart tragedy illustrated a complex interplay of mental health, control dynamics, and isolation. Jennifer and Sarah Hart's desire to maintain the image of the perfect family may have contributed to their decision to end all their lives, tragically taking the children with them. Experts note that while extreme, this case underscores how unchecked stress, secrecy, and control can culminate in catastrophic outcomes. Case SIX, Susan Eubanks, San Diego County. Susan Eubanks's case remains one of the most horrific filicides in San Diego County history. On an October day in 1997, Susan Eubanks shot her 4 sons, Brandon Armstrong, age 14, Austin Eubanks, age 7, Brigham Eubanks, age 6, and Matthew Eubanks, age 4, and then shot herself. The events shocked neighbors and launched a long, painful legal process that stretched through the late 1990s. Eubanks had endured an unstable, troubled personal history, marital problems, alleged substance use, and intense emotional strain that defense witnesses later described during trial. On the day the killings occurred in October of 1997, family turmoil and alcohol were factors investigators highlighted. She was found with a self-inflicted wound after the shootings. The community that had once regarded her as a private, if troubled, parent struggled to reconcile the quiet domestic front with the tragedy that followed. At trial, the prosecution argued that the killings were deliberate and criminally punishable, while the defense stressed Eubanks's impaired state and personal collapse. A jury convicted Eubanks of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The jury returned a verdict that included a death sentence on September 9, 1999, and the judgment of death was entered in October of 1999. Later changes in California law and policy led to resentencing developments in subsequent years. Reporting shows her sentence was later converted to life under procedural changes affecting capital cases. Case 7, Theresa Knorr, Sacramento County. Theresa Knorr's story remains one of California's most chilling and extensively documented histories of familial violence. Born Theresa Cross, she grew up in Sacramento and married young, with her first marriage collapsing under what relatives described as escalating volatility. By the early 1970s, she had 6 children and a deeply fractured home life defined by suspicion, domination, and repeated outbursts. Court documents later described her behavior as unpredictable, controlling, and increasingly isolated from reality. As her paranoia escalated, Theresa convinced herself that her daughters, Susan and Sheila, were conspiring against her. Family members later testified that she believed the girls were possessed, unclean, or working with outside forces. These beliefs fed into a strict and dangerous environment where she controlled food access, restricted movement, and enforced severe punishments. In 1982, Susan became the focus of Theresa's paranoia. After Susan attempted to leave the household, Theresa claimed that her daughter had brought evil back into the home. That same year, an argument spiraled into violence. Theresa shot Susan using a handgun she kept hidden. Instead of seeking medical care, she forced the older children to treat the wound at home. When Susan's condition worsened, Theresa escalated. She ordered 2 of her sons to carry Susan outside, place her in the family car, and drive her into a remote area off Highway 50 in the Sierra Nevada region. There, under Theresa's command, they left her. Susan died from her injuries and exposure. 2 years later, Theresa's growing instability turned toward her other daughter, Sheila. By 1985, Sheila was working outside the home, trying to build independence. Theresa interpreted this as betrayal. Court testimony revealed that she locked Sheila in a small closet for extended periods, limiting food and water. Her health deteriorated rapidly. When she died, Theresa ordered her sons to dispose of the body in a dumpster behind a commercial building in Placer County. The truth might never have surfaced if not for Theresa's youngest daughter, who escaped the home in the late 1980s. After years of silence and fear, she contacted authorities. Her detailed account of events prompted a multi-state investigation involving California and Nevada law enforcement. Detectives uncovered inconsistencies in medical records, missing person reports, and witness statements, eventually tying both deaths back to Theresa. Theresa Knorr was arrested in 1993 in Salt Lake City after years of evading attention. In court, she faced multiple charges, including murder, conspiracy, and extreme abuse. To avoid the death penalty, she accepted a plea agreement, receiving consecutive life sentences. If this story has stayed with you, hit like, subscribe, and share. Awareness helps communities recognize warning signs early. Case 8. Sonia Hermosillo, Orange County. On the warm August evening of August 22, 2011, the parking structure at Children's Hospital of Orange County, a place usually filled with anxious parents, medical staff hurrying between shifts, and the routine hum of hospital life, became the scene of a tragedy that would challenge the region's understanding of maternal mental health. 29-year-old Sonia Hermosillo arrived at the hospital with her 7-month-old son, Noe Medina Jr. The infant had been born with certain medical conditions requiring ongoing care. Hospital staff were used to seeing parents carry infants in and out with sleepy eyes and exhaustion etched across their faces. To many parents, CHOC was a place of hope. But on that night, Hermosillo did not check her son in, request care, or seek medical advice. Instead, prosecutors later said she carried him to the 4th level of the parking structure and pushed him over the edge. Moments later, witnesses reported seeing a baby lying on the ground below. Medical teams rushed to his aid and attempted everything possible to save him. Despite their efforts, the injuries proved fatal, and Noe died 2 days later. Hermosillo fled the scene but was later arrested. From the beginning, the case raised questions that divided professionals, families, and the public. Hermosillo's husband, Noe Medina Sr., told investigators that his wife had been struggling with postpartum mental health symptoms, including confusion and emotional withdrawal. He had attempted to secure treatment for her, and in earlier months, she had been admitted for psychiatric evaluation. Prosecutors, however, focused on her actions that night, driving to the hospital, parking, walking deliberately to the ledge, and leaving the scene afterward. They argued that these steps demonstrated intent, not a momentary break. Defense attorneys countered that untreated postpartum mental health symptoms had severely impaired her perception, judgment, and emotional stability. The case moved slowly through the legal system for years. Multiple psychiatric evaluations were ordered. There were periods when the court had to determine whether Hermosillo was competent to stand trial. Her mental state at the time of the incident and during court proceedings remained central in every hearing. Eventually, in August of 2021, a jury convicted Hermosillo of first-degree murder and assault on a child, causing death. During sentencing, the court acknowledged the defense's mental health claims but upheld the seriousness of the charges. She received a sentence of 30 years to life. Later appellate activity in 2022 and 2023 reviewed aspects of jury instructions, intent findings, and the handling of mental health evidence, but the conviction remained intact. The Orange County community responded to the case with a mixture of grief and debate. Some viewed it as a tragic failure of mental health intervention systems, pointing out that Noe's father had sought help for his wife and believed she was unsafe around the baby during her most difficult periods. Others argued that the act itself required full legal accountability, regardless of underlying mental strain. Case 9. Angela Phakhin, Sacramento County. Sacramento County deputies had seen many types of disturbance calls, but the string of incidents involving a young girl in a parked car during the heat waves of June 2017 felt different. Each time officers responded, they found the same mother, Angela Phakhin, and her 3-year-old daughter, Maya, inside a vehicle packed with personal belongings. The mother seemed agitated, disoriented, and resistant to assistance. Deputies attempted to offer resources, but the family kept moving from place to place, often in extreme temperatures. Witness accounts later described seeing Maya sitting in the back seat for hours, sometimes crying, sometimes strangely quiet, while Phakhin stood outside the car or wandered near it. When bystanders questioned the situation, Phakhin reportedly made cryptic statements about spirits and purification. These unusual claims would later become a central issue in the courtroom. On a late June day, one of the hottest days of the month, deputies were again called to investigate a vehicle parked on the side of the road. Inside, they found Maya unresponsive. Efforts to revive her were unsuccessful. The child's death was immediately treated as suspicious due to prior reports and the extreme temperatures inside the vehicle. Investigators soon found that the child had been subjected to repeated periods inside hot vehicles over several days. The key legal question became whether the mother's behavior was negligent, reckless, or something far more deliberate. As prosecutors began building their case, they introduced statements from Phakhin that referenced removing demons or purifying spirits. They argued that the mother believed her daughter was somehow cursed and sought to drive something out of her through deprivation. Defense attorneys argued that the mother was suffering from untreated mental health symptoms, possibly involving delusions or psychosis. Authorities also examined the role of Maya's father, who was frequently seen with them in the car during those weeks, though he faced separate proceedings. Witnesses described the couple as transient, often rotating between parking lots, roadside pull-offs, and empty fields. They seemed disconnected from family, community support, and available social service pathways. The case went to trial in June of 2019, drawing significant attention from Sacramento residents and the broader region. Prosecutors insisted that the prolonged and repeated exposure to heat was intentional. They argued that this was not a momentary lapse, but a belief-driven decision that placed Maya in life-threatening danger day after day. The defense presented experts who evaluated Phakhin's mental health, asserting that she was not grounded in reality during the events of that month. They argued that her beliefs were deeply distorted, shaped by delusions rather than malice. The jury heard days of testimony about the couple's transient lifestyle, their avoidance of shelters, and the strange, ritual-like behavior observed by witnesses. In late June 2019, the jury found Angela Phakhin guilty of first-degree murder. In July of that same year, she was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The sentencing judge noted the complexity of the case, but emphasized that the child had endured repeated exposure and that opportunities to seek help had been ignored. The Sacramento community reacted with a blend of sorrow and frustration. Some residents expressed outrage that intervention efforts had not been stronger after earlier calls to law enforcement. Others believed the case underscored the limitations placed on officers when parents refuse assistance, but do not appear to meet the threshold for involuntary evaluation. Case 10. Caro, Coronado, Carson, Los Angeles County. On May 20, 2014, Los Angeles County deputies responded to a home in West Carson after a frantic call from a family member reporting a disturbance. When deputies entered the residence, they encountered a scene that would become the center of a long, painful legal process involving 29-year-old mother Carol Ann Coronado and her 3 young daughters. Coronado had given birth to her youngest child only weeks earlier. In the months leading up to the incident, relatives noticed she appeared overwhelmed. They described her as exhausted, withdrawn, and sometimes speaking in ways that suggested she was losing her grounding in day-to-day reality. Some family members later testified that they worried she was experiencing postpartum emotional distress, though they struggled to determine how severe it was or how to intervene. On the day of the tragedy, deputies detained Coronado and began questioning family members who had arrived at the home shortly before law enforcement. What followed over the next weeks was a detailed investigation into Coronado's mental state, her recent behavior, her access to medical care, and the living environment inside the home. Prosecutors moved forward with charges of first-degree murder, arguing that Coronado's actions were deliberate and not the result of a temporary loss of control. Defense attorneys countered with a different narrative, that Coronado had been experiencing symptoms consistent with severe postpartum disorders, including confusion, paranoia, and auditory disturbances that significantly compromised her judgment. The trial drew national attention not only because of the tragedy itself, but because it highlighted a rarely discussed intersection of mental health, motherhood, and criminal responsibility. The defense called mental health professionals who evaluated Coronado and described her symptoms as consistent with a severe postpartum psychiatric condition. The prosecution argued that her actions and their sequence showed awareness and purposeful behavior. Unlike most high-profile cases, Coronado's trial was a bench trial, meaning the judge, not a jury, determined guilt. In November of 2015, the judge found her guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. During sentencing, carried out in 2016, the court acknowledged the emotional testimony of relatives who loved Coronado deeply, but ultimately issued a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case sparked immediate reaction from postpartum mental health advocates. Some believed the court should have considered the possibility of postpartum psychosis, arguing that the legal threshold for proving such a disorder is often too high. Others supported the ruling, stating that regardless of mental illness, 3 young children had lost their lives and the law had to respond accordingly. The tragic outcome also prompted deeper discussions within Los Angeles County about screening new mothers for acute mental distress, particularly during the weeks immediately after childbirth. Medical professionals and researchers began citing the case in seminars, calling for improved postpartum care access, increased home visiting programs, and better awareness among family members of warning signs that require immediate intervention. Even years later, the Coronado case remains part of California's broader conversation about maternal mental health and legal responsibility. It continues to appear in academic discussions, legal reviews, and mental health advocacy forums, examining how postpartum mental disorders intersect with criminal law. If these stories have made an impact on you, like, share, and subscribe. Awareness, conversation, and action are our best tools to protect children and families. As we reach the end of this deep historical overview, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. Every case discussed in this documentary began inside a home. Behind doors that looked ordinary from the outside, families were unraveling long before the public ever learned their names. These cases stretch across decades, across counties, and across dramatically different circumstances, but together they reveal the same painful truth. Vulnerable children often lived closest to the danger, and warning signs were either invisible, misunderstood, or never addressed in time. Each story leaves behind a trail of questions. How many neighbors, teachers, relatives, or health professionals sensed something was wrong but didn't know how to intervene? How many systems, medical, social, legal, were overwhelmed, underfunded, or too slow to respond? And how many tragedies could have been prevented if someone, somewhere, had stepped in at the right moment? These questions don't have simple answers, but revisiting these cases, understanding the patterns, and recognizing the indicators can spark necessary conversations about how communities respond to crises behind closed doors. Because accountability isn't only about the courtroom, it's about what a society chooses to notice, what it chooses to ignore, and what it chooses to protect. Before we close out today's documentary, let me ask you this. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might help someone understand the bigger picture. If you've watched until now, thank you for staying with me through this difficult but important exploration into California's most documented, most haunting maternal crimes. Your engagement helps amplify stories that matter and ensures that victims are not forgotten. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting independent reporting. And as always, stay safe, stay observant, and I'll see you in the next one.